The night Cecilia Vane became a duchess, the house was already cold. It was not the cold of winter, though October had arrived early that year with a grey shoulder turned against the countryside. It was the cold of a place where warmth had never been invited, where fires were lit for appearances and not for comfort, where the corridors were long and the silences longer. Cecilia stepped through the entrance of Hargrove Hall on the arm of Edmund Hargrove, Duke of Ashwell, and felt the house close around her like a hand that was not unkind, exactly, but was certainly not gentle. She was 22 years old. She had agreed to the marriage in March, in her mother's sitting room, while rain knocked against the window and her father stood with his back to both of them. Her father, George Vane, was a man who expressed his deepest feelings by studying the middle distance. She had understood, watching the set of his shoulders, that the matter was already decided. The discussion she had been summoned to was not a conversation, it was a notification. Edmund Hargrove was 41. He had dark hair going silver at the temples, a straight back, and eyes the color of pewter. He was not unkind in the way that some men of his position were unkind. He did not raise his voice, he did not make cruel remarks, he did not treat the servants with contempt. He treated everyone with a kind of careful, measured indifference, as though people were pieces of furniture he had inherited and saw no particular reason to move. He had shaken Cecilia's hand when they were introduced, not her fingers, in the way that men sometimes held a woman's hand as though it were a delicate object requiring special handling. He had shaken her hand the way he would shake a solicitor's hand, businesslike, assessed. She had found that, strangely, she preferred it to the alternative. The engagement lasted 4 months. During that time Edmund visited the Vane house in Wiltshire twice. Both visits were brief. He brought flowers on the first occasion, carnations, which Cecilia did not particularly like but received with a warm smile, and a book on the second, a history of the English countryside that she genuinely enjoyed and suspected he had chosen by asking someone else. He was polite at dinner. He asked her father about the land and her mother about her health, and Cecilia about whether she found the country air agreeable. She said she did. He nodded. That was more or less the full catalogue of their courtship. She had not expected love. She was intelligent enough and had been raised by people honest enough in their quiet way that she understood the nature of the arrangement. Her family needed the connection. The Vane estate had been quietly struggling for 11 years, since a bad series of harvests and a worse series of decisions. The Hargrove name and the Hargrove land were solvent, solid, and old. Edmund needed an heir and, more practically, needed the appearance of domestic stability that a wife would provide. These were the terms. They were unspoken, but they were the terms all the same. What she had not expected, and what no one had prepared her for, was the silence. On the evening of their wedding, after the guests had gone and the house had emptied into the quiet of 11 o'clock, Cecilia sat in the bedroom that had been prepared for her and waited. She had changed out of the wedding dress with the help of a maid, a young woman named Ruth who had quick, gentle hands and the manner of someone who understood that the less said, the better. Ruth had unfastened the long row of buttons at the back, and had draped the dress carefully over the chair near the window, and had said good night with a small curtsy, and had left. Cecilia sat on the edge of the bed. She waited until midnight. Edmund did not come. She told herself, climbing under the heavy quilt and reaching to turn out the lamp, that this was not a humiliation. She was a practical woman. She understood that men of Edmund's class had their own rhythms, their own habits, their own schedules that had nothing to do with the feelings of the people around them. She told herself that this was simply the shape of the thing, and that shapes could be adjusted to. She believed this mostly. In the morning Edmund was at breakfast before her, reading a newspaper, a cup of coffee at his elbow. He looked up when she entered, nodded pleasantly, and said, "Good morning. I hope the room was comfortable." She said it was. He returned to the newspaper. She poured tea and sat down and looked at the silver toast rack and the butter dish and the pot of orange marmalade, and understood that this was her life now, and that it was going to require a different kind of strength than she had previously imagined. The house itself was formidable. Hargrove Hall sat on 400 acres of Gloucestershire countryside, a grey stone building with large windows and formal gardens that were beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when money has been spent on them for a very long time. There were 22 rooms on the main floors, plus the servants' quarters and the kitchens and the cellars and the long, low outbuildings at the back. The grounds included a walled kitchen garden, a wood, a lake that was more of a large pond, and a series of lawns that rolled away in every direction with the confidence of land that had always belonged to someone and always expected to. There were 9 indoor servants when Cecilia arrived. The housekeeper was a woman named Mrs. Prout, who had been at Hargrove Hall for 23 years and who managed the household with the quiet, unmovable authority of someone who had seen several mistresses come and go and had outlasted all of them. She was not unfriendly to Cecilia. She was precise, efficient, and absolutely impenetrable. She answered every question Cecilia asked with a correct and complete answer, and volunteered nothing beyond it. The first time Cecilia asked Mrs. Prout about the house's schedule, the meals, the cleaning patterns when the rooms were aired, Mrs. Prout answered everything thoroughly and then folded her hands and waited, clearly ready for the next question. Cecilia asked several more. Mrs. Prout answered them all. At no point did she offer an opinion or reveal a preference. She was, Cecilia thought, the most controlled person she had ever met. It took Cecilia 6 weeks to realize that Mrs. Prout's control was not coldness. It was self-protection. It was the armor of a woman who had learned, over 2 decades, that the safest way to survive in that house was to observe everything and say nothing. The realization arrived quietly one afternoon when Cecilia came into the kitchen unexpectedly and found Mrs. Prout standing very still at the window, looking out at the garden with an expression that was, for just a moment, unguarded. There was something tired in it, something that knew things and had carried them a long time. Mrs. Prout heard her step and turned immediately. The expression was gone. The folded hands came back. "Shall I bring tea to the morning room, Your Grace?" "Yes," Cecilia said, "thank you." She began to learn the house the way you learn a language you were not born to, slowly, with attention, with the understanding that every room had its own grammar and its own rules, and that making yourself at home required translating all of them first. She learned that Edmund spent most of his time in the study on the east side of the ground floor, and that this room was, by unspoken agreement, his territory entirely. She learned that the formal dining room was used only when guests came, and that Edmund and Cecilia ate most evenings in the smaller room off the library, with a gap between their chairs at the table that felt, on certain evenings, as wide as a field. She learned that there was a locked door at the end of the upper west corridor that no one mentioned and that she never asked about. She told herself this was good sense. She told herself, on the evenings when the lamp light caught the lock and made it gleam, that it was none of her concern. She had always read. She had grown up in a house where books were everywhere, stacked on every available surface, borrowed and returned and borrowed again, and reading had always been, for her, the nearest thing to freedom that didn't require leaving the room. She made her way through the library at Hargrove Hall in the first 2 months with the focused attention of someone mapping new territory. The collection was excellent. Whoever had assembled it over the previous generations had done so with genuine taste, and she found, moving along the shelves with a candle on winter afternoons, a kind of companionship in it that she had not expected to need as much as she did. She wrote letters. She wrote to her mother twice a week at first, then once a week, the letters careful and cheerful, full of observations about the house and the garden and the local village and the weather, which in Gloucestershire that winter was spectacular in its bleakness. Her mother wrote back with news of Wiltshire, of the neighbours, of her father's various projects, and with a warmth in every letter that Cecilia held onto the way you hold onto something in a current. She walked, every morning, regardless of the weather. She put on her coat and her boots and went out into the grounds and walked until the cold air had done whatever it needed to do to her thoughts, and then she came back inside and got on with the day. Edmund noted her walks. Not with warmth exactly, but with a kind of neutral approval, as one notes that a household appliance is functioning correctly. "You are well?" he asked one morning at breakfast, glancing up from his newspaper. "The walks seem to agree with you." She said they did. He nodded and returned to the page. It was in these months, in that season of learning and adjusting and enduring, that Cecilia Vane became, quietly and without announcement, a woman of formidable inner resources. She did not break. She did not weep in the corridors or rage at the walls or collapse under the weight of the life she had been handed. She absorbed it. She translated it. She looked at the house around her, and the man across the breakfast table, and the long, lovely, empty days stretching out in every direction, and she made, without words, the decision that would define the next 40 years of her life. She would not disappear. She would not become one of those women who married into these houses and were simply absorbed into them, who faded into the wallpaper and the routine until their own husbands would have been hard-pressed to describe the color of their eyes. She would keep herself, all of herself, even the parts that had no immediate use. She began keeping a journal in November, 2 months after the wedding. She wrote in it every evening before bed, in a small leather-bound book that she kept in the drawer of her writing table. The entries were not dramatic. They recorded the day's events, her observations about the people around her, the things she had read, the things she had noticed. She wrote about the house. She wrote about the garden. She wrote occasionally about Edmund, carefully, without malice, with the particular precision of someone studying a specimen they cannot yet categorize. She wrote in one entry, "He is not a cruel man. I am quite certain of that, but I am equally certain that cruelty is not the only way a person can fail to see you." The winter was long. The early months of 1868 were gray and damp, and Cecilia spent them reading and walking and learning and observing, and waiting, without quite knowing what she was waiting for the shape of her life to become clearer. She attended the local church on Sundays with Edmund, who held her arm on the path from the carriage and released it precisely when they reached the door. She attended 2 small dinner parties at neighboring estates, where she was polite and well-spoken, and observed that the other women at these events fell into 2 categories: those who seemed happy and those who had learned to perform happiness with great skill, and that distinguishing between the groups required more information than a dinner party provided. She did not tell anyone that she was unhappy. She was not entirely certain she was unhappy. She was something more complicated than unhappy. She was unsatisfied and understimulated, and aware, in a way that felt like a low continuous note running under everything, that she was being steadily wasted. But she also had food and shelter and books, and the ability to walk outside each morning, and she had observed enough of the world to know that many people had considerably less, and that this knowledge did not make her own situation better, but did make self-pity feel like an extravagance she could not quite justify. The spring came, the gardens bloomed. Cecilia cut flowers from the walled garden and arranged them in the rooms, and found a pleasure in this that surprised her, not the arranging itself, but the ability to alter the look of a room, to change the way light fell, to impose something living and colorful on a space that tended toward the formal and the gray. She began suggesting small changes: a different tablecloth at dinner, chairs rearranged in the morning room to catch the afternoon light better. Mrs. Prout implemented each suggestion with complete neutrality. Edmund did not comment on any of them, which Cecilia understood by now was not indifference but simply his way. And then it was autumn again, and Mrs. Dorothea Fane arrived at Hargrove Hall. The invitation had been mentioned at dinner one evening in September, which Cecilia had noted at the time as unusual. Edmund rarely mentioned guests in advance. Most of his correspondence was handled in the study, behind the closed door, and Cecilia understood nothing about his social arrangements until they affected the household directly. But that evening he had looked up from his plate and said, in his usual even tone, "A Mrs. Fane will be visiting at the end of October. She is an acquaintance from London. I expect you to make her comfortable." "Of course," Cecilia said. "How long will she be staying?" "A few days," Edmund said. He returned to his dinner. The subject was apparently closed. Cecilia asked Mrs. Prout the following morning if she knew anything about a Mrs. Fane. Mrs. Prout folded her hands. "I believe the lady has visited the hall before, your grace," she said. Her tone was exactly what it always was. "Some years ago, I will have the blue guest room prepared." "Before," Cecilia said. "How long ago?" "I believe it was 1864, your grace, or thereabouts." A pause so small it was almost not a pause. "Before his grace's marriage." Cecilia nodded. "Thank you, Mrs. Prout." She went to the morning room and sat down with her book. She read the same paragraph 4 times before she accepted that she was not reading. Dorothea Fane arrived on a Thursday afternoon in late October, in a hired carriage from the station, with 2 leather cases and a hat box, and the sort of unhurried composure that Cecilia associated with women who had decided at some point that they did not need to perform anything for anyone. She was perhaps 35, with dark eyes and a handsome face and the kind of beauty that improves at close range, that has detail and intelligence in it. She wore a deep blue traveling coat, and she carried herself as though she knew exactly how much space she was entitled to in every room she entered. Edmund met her in the entrance hall. Cecilia watched from the top of the stairs. It was the way he moved to meet her that she would remember afterward. Edmund was not a man who moved quickly. His habitual pace was measured, contained, the walk of someone who had never been in a hurry in his life. But when the front door opened and Dorothea Fane stepped through it, something shifted in him. It was not dramatic, it was barely visible, but Cecilia, who had spent more than a year studying this man with the attention of someone who had no choice but to pay attention, saw it. A fractional loosening. A thing that might in another person have looked like relief. He said her name, Dorothea. She said his, Edmund. Neither of them looked toward the stairs. Cecilia stood very still for a moment. Then she walked down to greet her guest, her expression arranged with the care and precision of someone who has decided, in the space of 3 seconds, exactly who she is going to be. "Mrs. Fane," she said, "welcome to Hargrove Hall." Dorothea Fane turned and looked at her. The look was clear and direct, and Cecilia thought, honestly curious, the look of a woman taking the full measure of another woman without trying to pretend she was doing anything else. "Duchess," she said, "what a beautiful house." "It is," Cecilia agreed. "I find it improving the longer I know it." She smiled. Dorothea smiled back. Edmund stood between them and looked at neither of them. That evening at dinner, Cecilia watched. She did not watch in the way of a woman searching for evidence of something she feared. She watched in the way she had learned to watch everything in that house, with patience and precision and the careful stillness of someone cataloging rather than reacting. She watched the way Edmund spoke to Dorothea, with an ease he had with almost no one else, a genuine, unguarded ease that Cecilia had never in 14 months of marriage been the recipient of. She watched the way Dorothea listened to him, not with the deferential attention that most women gave most men of his rank, but with real engagement, with the comfort of someone who had heard this voice speak freely before and knew its register. She watched and she understood. And in that understanding something settled in her, not peace exactly, not resignation, something harder than both, something that was perhaps the beginning of clarity. She reached for her wine glass. She kept her hand perfectly steady. She said to no one in particular, "The cook has done something remarkable with the lamb this evening." And both Dorothea and Edmund agreed that she had, and the dinner continued, and the fire burned in the grate, and outside the Gloucestershire dark settled over the gardens and the lawns and the long, cold acres of Hargrove land. Cecilia ate her dinner. She listened to the conversation. She noted without expression that Edmund laughed twice, a real laugh, the brief, genuine kind, at something Dorothea said, and that he had not laughed in 14 months once in Cecilia's company. She kept her face pleasant, and her voice warm and her thoughts her own, and when dinner was over she made her excuses and went upstairs and sat at her writing table and opened her journal. She did not write anything dramatic. She did not write anything angry. She wrote, "I understand the house now. I understand the locked door." She put the pen down. She closed the journal. She sat for a long time looking at the flame in the lamp on her table, thinking about the particular kind of loneliness that exists not in being alone, but in being present in a room where the warmth is clearly for someone else. Then she went to bed. And in the morning she was up before Edmund, dressed before anyone else in the house, walking in the garden with the frost still white on the grass and the air cold enough to make her eyes water. She walked to the far end of the kitchen garden, where the old apple trees stood in their winter rows, and she stood among them for a while with her face turned up to the pale morning sky. She was not going to disappear. That was the thing she had decided in November, in those early months when she was still learning what she had married into. And it was the thing she decided again now more firmly, with more information. She was going to stay in this house, and she was going to manage it well, and she was going to walk in these gardens every morning and read in this library every afternoon and sit at this dinner table every evening, and she was going to remain, stubbornly and completely, herself. Whatever else was happening under this roof, she was going to be here. She turned and walked back toward the house. The kitchen windows were lit, the cook already at work, the first thin smoke rising from the chimney. The house looked from the outside perfectly ordinary, perfectly settled, the house of a duke and his duchess exactly as it was supposed to look. Cecilia Vane pushed open the gate and went inside. Dorothea Fane stayed for 4 days. In those 4 days, Cecilia learned more about her husband than she had in the previous 14 months of marriage, not because anything was explained to her, not because Edmund said anything revealing or Dorothea let something slip. She learned it the way she learned everything in that house, by watching, by listening, by paying attention to the textures of ordinary moments that most people moved through without noticing. She learned that Edmund smiled with his whole face when Dorothea was speaking. He did not do this with anyone else. With other people, with Cecilia, with guests, with tradesmen and tenants and the local vicar, his smiles were correct and brief, the expression of a man fulfilling a social obligation. With Dorothea they arrived without warning and lingered past the point of duty. They made him look younger. They made him look, Cecilia thought, like someone who had once been considerably less careful. She learned that they walked together in the afternoon, Edmund and Dorothea, along the path that followed the edge of the kitchen garden and turned south toward the old orchard. Cecilia watched them from the morning room window on the second day. They walked close together, not touching, but with the particular proximity of people who are comfortable within each other's radius, who have long since negotiated the question of personal space and arrived at an agreement. They were talking as they walked. Dorothea gestured at something in the orchard. Edmund turned to look. They both stopped for a moment, looking at whatever it was, one of the old trees perhaps, or a bird, or simply the quality of the light on that particular afternoon. Then they walked on. It was such a small thing. Just two people walking. But Cecilia had stood at that window and watched, and she had known, with the kind of knowing that lives in the body rather than the mind, that she was looking at something that had been going on for a very long time. On the third evening, the evening after the walk, Cecilia woke at 2 in the morning to the sound of footsteps in the corridor. She lay still. The footsteps were unhurried, quiet, moving from the direction of the east wing toward the upper corridor where the guest rooms were. She recognized the sound of Edmund's shoes. She had lived in this house long enough to know the specific quality of his footfall on the old floorboards, the way his right heel landed with slightly more weight than his left. The footsteps stopped. A door opened quietly. A door closed quietly. Cecilia lay in the darkness and stared at the ceiling of her bedroom. She had known before this. She had understood from the first evening at dinner with the clarity of someone who had been paying attention since October. But knowing and confirming are different things, and the confirmation, the quiet, careful footsteps in the dark corridor, the soft closing of a door settled into her in a way that was not grief exactly and not anger exactly, but was something she would carry with her, quietly and without complaint, for a very long time. She did not get up, she did not cry. She lay still in the darkness and breathed evenly and thought about what she was going to do, which was, in the end, the same thing she had been doing all along. She was going to get up in the morning and put on her clothes and eat her breakfast and manage her house and remain, stubbornly and completely, herself. There was a particular kind of strength required for this. It was not the dramatic, visible strength of women who confronted and demanded and insisted on their rights in loud, public ways. Cecilia had admiration for that kind of strength, but it was not the kind she had been given. Her kind was quieter and, she suspected, considerably more difficult to sustain. It was the strength of continuing, of refusing to let the shape of your life be entirely determined by someone else's choices. Dorothea Fane left on the fourth day, a Friday morning, in the same hired carriage she had arrived in. Cecilia stood at the front door beside Edmund and watched the carriage roll down the drive. Edmund's face was, as always, composed, but there was something in the set of his shoulders, just for a moment after the carriage turned out of sight, that looked like a door closing. "A pleasant visit," Cecilia said. "Yes," Edmund said. They went inside for breakfast. Over the following weeks, Cecilia thought carefully about what she had observed and about what she intended to do with the observation. The options, as she catalogued them in her journal in November of 1868, were limited. She could confront Edmund. She had turned this possibility over a number of times, testing its weight. But what would a confrontation accomplish? Edmund would deny or deflect, or acknowledge and continue regardless. He had not married her for her feelings. He had married her because the arrangement suited the requirements of his life, and the arrangement would continue to suit those requirements whether she raised the matter at breakfast or not. She could leave. This option she considered more seriously than it might seem. She was not, after all, a woman without resources. She had her own mind, her own education, her own small income from an aunt's legacy that was technically hers under the terms of her father's settlement. But leaving in 1868 for a woman of her class was not the uncomplicated act it might theoretically be. There would be consequences for her family, for her name, for every door that would quietly close in her direction for the rest of her life. She had watched enough of the world to understand what happened to women who left, and she was not yet ready to pay that price. She could stay and endure and say nothing and let herself be quietly hollowed out by the enduring. She rejected this immediately with a force that surprised her. She would not be hollowed out. She had already decided that. Which left the fourth option, the one she turned to with a kind of calm relief. She could stay and not endure but live. Differently than she had imagined. Differently than she had been told marriage was supposed to be, but fully, with intention, with the deliberate, daily choice to remain engaged in her own existence. She began, in those weeks after Dorothea's visit, to take the house more seriously. not more seriously in the way of a wife performing her duties, but in the way of someone who has decided that a place is worth caring about, who has looked at a thing and thought, I am going to make something of this. She began to speak more directly with Mrs. Prout about the running of the estate, asking questions that went beyond the domestic arrangements and into the management of the grounds, the kitchen garden, the small home farm that supplied the house with milk and eggs. Mrs. Prout answered her questions with the same precision she brought to everything, and Cecilia listened and asked more questions, and gradually the conversations between them began to have a different quality, less formal, more collaborative. Mrs. Prout was not easily warmed, but she was fair. She recognized competence when she saw it, and she saw it in Cecilia, and she adjusted accordingly. Cecilia also began to involve herself more in the village. There was a small school in Ashwell. Edmund contributed to its funding, as dutiful aristocrats were expected to do, and Cecilia presented herself to the schoolmaster one afternoon in November and asked what the school needed most. He told her, with the cautious honesty of a man unsure how seriously to take this question, that the main shortage was books. She went home and spent 2 days in the library, identifying duplicates and texts that Edmund would not miss, and sent 4 boxes to the school within the week. It was a small thing, but it was something she had decided on and executed herself, without asking permission, without consulting Edmund, without running it past Mrs. Prout for approval. She had simply done it. The feeling this produced, small, solid, almost physical, was so different from the general texture of her days that she sat with it for a while and tried to understand exactly what it was. It took her a couple of days to identify it correctly. It was agency. The sensation of acting in the world, rather than being acted upon by it. She wanted more of it. She began to write more letters, not just to her mother but to acquaintances and old friends from her life before the marriage, women she had known in Wiltshire and at the school she had attended in Bath. She asked them questions about their lives, their interests, the things they were reading. She shared her own observations. The correspondence grew slowly into something that resembled a proper intellectual life, conducted in envelopes. One of her correspondents, a woman named Agnes Hartley, who had married a solicitor in Bristol, wrote back with recommendations for books and opinions on politics and questions about the estate that were so well framed that Cecilia wrote 3 pages in return without stopping. Read about agriculture. She read about estate management. She read books on household economy that she found on the lower shelves of the library, dusty and untouched, that turned out to be enormously informative. She began to understand for the first time the relationship between the house and the land around it, how the farms worked, how the rents were structured, what the estate actually produced and what it spent, and what the gap between the 2 numbers meant for the people who depended on it. Edmund was not unaware of this. He came home one afternoon in early December to find Cecilia in the estate office, a room she had never entered before, with the land steward, a careful, weathered man named Mr. Hatch, going through the annual accounts. He stood in the doorway for a moment. His expression did not change. He said, "I was not aware you were interested in the accounts." "I thought I should understand the estate," Cecilia said. "Mr. Hatch has been very helpful." Edmund looked at Mr. Hatch, who looked at the floor with the studied neutrality of a man who intended to survive whatever happened next. Edmund looked back at Cecilia. Something passed across his face, not displeasure exactly, more like recalibration. "Very well," he said. He went to his study. He did not raise the matter again. Mr. Hatch, at the next session, brought additional ledgers without being asked. Winter came fully in December, hard and clear and brilliant. Cecilia walked every morning in boots and a heavy wool coat, in air that was cold enough to hurt the inside of her nose, and she came back each time feeling cleaned out and sharpened. She had always liked the cold. Her mother used to say that Cecilia was one of those people who are at their best when the temperature drops, a quality she associated with practicality, with the ability to function when comfort has been removed. Edmund spent much of December in London. Business, he said. He left on a Tuesday and returned the following Thursday. He was civil and correct at dinner and in the mornings, and Cecilia was civil and correct in return, and the house ran smoothly in his absence, because she had spent 2 months making sure that it would. She thought about Dorothea Fane sometimes, not obsessively, not with rage, more in the way you return to a puzzle you have not yet fully assembled, turning the pieces over in your mind. She thought about what kind of woman Dorothea was, the composure, the intelligence in those dark eyes, the way she had looked at Cecilia at the front door as though she was someone worth looking at carefully. She found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she did not hate Dorothea Fane. She did not think Dorothea Fane was a good person, exactly, or a moral one, in the simple ledger sense. But she thought she understood her at least partly. Dorothea had found something in Edmund that she valued enough to maintain the connection across years and circumstances. That was, in its way, a kind of loyalty, misapplied, Cecilia thought, morally complicated, but not unintelligible. What she felt more sharply and more often was the absence at the center of the arrangement. Edmund had this woman, whatever the nature of their connection, he had her, the ease of her, the comfort of someone who knew him and whose presence visibly restored something in him. And Cecilia had no one like that. She had her correspondence and her books and her morning walks and her growing understanding of the estate accounts, and these things were real and valuable and not to be dismissed. But they were not the same as a person who looked at you as though you mattered. She wrote to Agnes Hartley about this obliquely, not the specific facts of her situation, but the general question of what it meant to be a woman in a house that was technically yours but did not feel entirely like it. Agnes wrote back a letter that was so precisely understanding, so warm and clear-eyed and unsentimental, that Cecilia read it 3 times and kept it in the back of her journal. Agnes wrote, "The house becomes yours when you decide to take it, not when someone gives it." Christmas came. Edmund's brother and his wife visited for a week, a large, loud couple named Henry and Beatrice Hargrove who brought 3 children under 10, and filled the house with a noise and energy that Cecilia found exhausting and also, she admitted to herself, slightly wonderful. Beatrice was a large-hearted, energetic woman who had strong opinions about everything and shared them freely, and who took an immediate and genuine liking to Cecilia that was entirely uncomplicated by the social calculations that governed most of the relationships in Cecilia's current life. On the 3rd evening, when Edmund and Henry had retreated to the study after dinner with their port and their memories of a shared childhood, Beatrice and Cecilia sat by the fire and talked for 2 hours. Beatrice talked about her children, about the farm she and Henry were developing in Derbyshire, about a scheme she had for improving the local road, about a book she was reading on Roman history, about the way Henry snored in a particular key that she had once, she claimed, been able to identify from the next floor. She was magnificent, she was unstoppable. She was, Cecilia thought, the most alive person she had encountered since leaving Wiltshire. At one point Beatrice paused, looked at Cecilia with her direct, uncomplicated gaze and said, "You're doing well here, I can see it. It's not easy, I imagine." Cecilia looked at her. "No," she said, "it is not always easy." Beatrice nodded. She did not push for more. She reached for the poker and nudged the fire, and the flames rose and fell, and the room was warm. And for a little while Cecilia felt the specific relief of being with someone who saw her clearly and required nothing in return for the seeing. January brought the new year and the quietude that follows family departures. The house settled back into its pattern. Edmund at his desk, Cecilia at her books or her correspondence or her sessions with Mr. Hatch or her morning walks or her afternoons at the school in the village, which she had begun visiting twice a week to hear the children read and to bring additional materials when she could. She was building something, she understood that now. Not the life she had imagined, not the marriage she had been told it would be, not the companionship or the warmth or the sense of mutual regard that she had, somewhere beneath all the practical understanding, hoped might develop, but something real and hers and worth the effort. She was building a presence, a place in the world that was genuinely occupied by her particular self. And in February, on a grey Tuesday morning when the frost was still on the inside of the kitchen windows, and the garden was buried under 2 inches of new snow, she woke at 6 o'clock and lay in the quiet and understood, with a certainty that was very still and very clear, that she was going to have a child. She lay there for a long time. She was afraid and also something else, something she did not have a word for immediately, something that was warmer than relief and quieter than joy. When the word finally arrived, lying in the cold and the quiet of that February morning, it surprised her. The word was hope. Not for herself, not for the marriage or the house or the long complicated arrangement that was her life, but for this new thing, this possibility, this voice she had not yet heard and could already imagine talking to. For this she felt something genuinely new, something that did not require the house or Edmund or the locked door at the end of the west corridor or any of the complex machinery of the life she had found herself in. Just this. She got up, she dressed. She went downstairs and had her breakfast and began her day. She did not tell Edmund that morning. She did not tell anyone for 2 more weeks. She kept it close, in those first weeks, The way you keep something precious before you are sure you can trust the world with it. She told Edmund on a Wednesday evening in late February, over dinner. She had chosen the timing deliberately. Edmund was in a steady mood that evening. He had spent the day reviewing the estate papers with the land steward, and had returned to the house in the late afternoon with the particular quality of someone who has dealt with matters they find manageable and is temporarily satisfied. He ate with more engagement than usual. He spoke about the spring planting. He poured his own wine twice without seeming to notice, which, in Cecilia's reading of her husband, was a reliable sign that his mind was reasonably untroubled. She waited until the dishes had been cleared and the second glasses poured. Then she said simply, "I am expecting a child. I believe it will arrive in October." Edmund set down his glass. He looked at her with the precise, careful attention he rarely directed at her, and she was struck again, as she had been struck occasionally since the beginning of this marriage, by the intelligence in his face when it was fully engaged. He was not an unintelligent man. He was a man who kept his intelligence very largely to himself. "You are certain," he said. "Quite certain," Cecilia said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That is good news." He picked up his glass again. He said, "You should see a physician. I will arrange for someone from London." "I would prefer the local physician," Cecilia said. "Dr. Fellow seems competent, and I would like to consult with the midwife at Ashwell Village, Annie Tull. I have been told she is very experienced." Edmund looked at her in a way that was not quite surprise and not quite disapproval, more like the look of someone encountering a version of a situation that is slightly different from what they had anticipated. "A midwife," he said. "Many women find their care preferable," Cecilia said, pleasantly. "I understand she has delivered more than 200 children in this county. I find that a more reliable credential than a diploma from a London school." Edmund absorbed this. He did not argue. She had learned by now that Edmund did not argue about things he considered peripheral to his central concerns. The health arrangements of his wife fell, apparently, into this category. "As you prefer," he said. She thanked him. They finished their wine. They said good night in the hallway with the usual formality of their partings, and Cecilia went upstairs and wrote in her journal for an hour with the quiet, focused energy of someone who has taken the next step in a long project and is already thinking about the one after. She met Annie Tull the following week. Annie was 53 years old, short and broad-shouldered, with hands that were capable and quick, and a face that had the permanently weather-tan look of someone who spent as much time walking the lanes of the county as she did indoors. She had been delivering babies in Ashwell and the surrounding parishes for 28 years. She had delivered babies in farmhouses and in fine rooms, and on one occasion, in a barn during a thunderstorm, and she treated all of these experiences with the same straightforward calm that she brought to everything. She came to the hall on a Thursday morning. She was shown in by Mrs. Prout with the polished courtesy that Mrs. Prout extended to all visitors regardless of their station. Cecilia received her in the morning room. The first thing Annie Tull did, upon shaking Cecilia's hand, was look at her with a directness that most people in the hall did not bring to their interactions with the Duchess. It was not an impertinent look. It was the look of someone whose profession required accurate assessment before anything else, and who had learned that accuracy demanded looking at things plainly. "Your Grace," Annie said. "Mrs. Tull," Cecilia said, "please sit down." They talked for an hour. Annie asked questions with the methodical patience of someone who had asked them many times before and knew exactly which answers mattered. She asked about Cecilia's health, her sleep, her appetite, the various physical changes that had accompanied the early months. She was direct without being indelicate, thorough without being alarming. At the end of the hour she sat back and said, with the confidence of someone rendering a verdict, that everything she could observe suggested a healthy pregnancy proceeding normally. "You are strong," Annie said. "Stronger than you perhaps look, Your Grace, if you do not mind my saying so." "I do not mind at all," Cecilia said. "I consider it a compliment." Annie's expression shifted just slightly, a small, private approval. "You will do well," she said. "Stay walking, keep eating, rest when your body insists on it, but do not take to your bed before you need to. Women who take to their beds too early often find the confinement considerably harder than it needs to be." Cecilia nodded. She would have told anyone who asked that she had expected to like Annie Tull, based on her reputation in the village. What she had not expected was to feel, in the space of an hour, that she had encountered someone who could be relied on. This was not a feeling she had experienced often since arriving at Hargrove Hall. It was the more valuable for being rare. She saw Annie twice a month through the spring and summer. These appointments became, over the months that followed, something she found herself looking forward to, not merely for the practical reassurance of Annie's assessments, but for the quality of Annie's company. The midwife was not a gossip, was not a flatterer, was not interested in the particulars of the hall's social arrangements or the Duchess's position or any of the surrounding machinery of rank and title. She was interested in how Cecilia was sleeping, and whether her ankles were swollen, and whether she had been walking and what she was eating. She was interested in the physical fact of a woman carrying a child, and in making sure both of them came through it well. This made her, in the landscape of Cecilia's life, a remarkable rarity. A person who was interested in Cecilia for purely practical reasons, having nothing to do with her social utility. Spring arrived in April with a suddenness that the garden appeared to welcome with relief, everything blooming at once in a burst of color that seemed almost impatient. Cecilia walked each morning in air that was warming by the week, watching the walled garden come back to life, the fruit trees blossom, the beds in the formal garden push through the earth in orderly rows. She found the spring particularly vivid that year, as though something in her own condition had sharpened her attention to the visible evidence of things beginning. She was showing by June. Not dramatically, she had always been slight and her constitution was, as Annie said, strong but visibly. She had her dresses altered by the seamstress in the village and wore them without fuss, and continued her morning walks and her afternoon sessions with Mr. Hatch and her twice-weekly visits to the school, where the children accepted the visible evidence of the Duchess's condition with the casual directness of children who have not yet learned to find such things awkward. Edmund noted her appearance with the same neutral acknowledgement he brought to most things. "You look well," he said one evening at dinner in May, and Cecilia understood this as the most she was likely to get in the way of engagement with the matter, and accepted it accordingly. He was in London more frequently that spring and summer. Not excessively, he maintained what could be described as a reasonable pattern of attendance, present for enough of the week that the arrangement could not be called neglect if measured by the calendar. But Cecilia was aware, from the rhythm of his departures and returns, that the pull was not business in any conventional sense. He returned from these trips with the particular settled quality she had first observed in October, when Dorothea Fane had been at the hall, that fractional loosening, that sense of a man who has been somewhere he could breathe more easily. She did not raise it. She had made her decision about what raising it would accomplish, and the decision had not changed. What she had instead were her journals and her correspondence and her morning walks, and Annie Tull's capable, unflappable company twice a month, and these were enough to carry her through. She wrote to Agnes Hartley about the pregnancy in April. Agnes wrote back a letter that was warm and practical and full of good advice, and also contained a passage that Cecilia returned to several times in the weeks that followed. "A child will love you without requiring anything that you are not. I have found this to be the most reliable truth in my experience of mothering." She thought about this a great deal in those months. She had not until now given much conscious thought to the kind of mother she wanted to be, partly because the abstract category of motherhood had seemed, since her marriage, considerably less immediate than the concrete requirements of simply surviving in this house. But now it arrived as a real and pressing question, one she brought to her journal and her morning walks and her long afternoons in the library with the same deliberate attention she brought to the estate accounts or the school reading lists. She wanted to be the kind of mother who was present, actually present, in the way that full attention is a form of presence, not just physical proximity. She had experienced both kinds of parental presence and their absence, her father's perpetual physical nearness combined with his almost total emotional distance, her mother's genuine warmth, which compensated for much but could not compensate for everything. She wanted to offer her child something that combined her mother's warmth with the rigorous honesty she had come to value in Annie Tull and in Agnes's letters, warmth without illusion, presence without performance. The summer was unusually warm. July and August brought heat that turned the lawns golden and dried the lane into a pale ribbon of dust between the hedgerows. Cecilia moved more slowly, Annie noted, but with the same steady determination. "You do not complain," Annie said one afternoon, with a tone that was not quite admiration and not quite surprise, but somewhere between the two. "What would I complain to?" Cecilia said. Annie looked at her with that clear, direct gaze. "Most people find something," she said. "I find things," Cecilia said. "I simply address them to the journal rather than the household." Annie's small private approval appeared again. "That is wise," she said. "The journal does not repeat itself at dinner." Cecilia laughed, a real laugh, quick and genuine. Annie looked mildly pleased with herself. She began preparing the nursery in August. The room chosen was on the upper west corridor, adjacent to the bedroom at the far end, the one she intended for herself during the later months of her confinement, to be closer to where the child would sleep. She oversaw the preparations herself, working with Mrs. Prout and the two housemaids to clear and clean and furnish the room with care. She found in the attic an old cradle that had apparently been in the Hargrove family for several generations, its wood darkened with age but solid and beautifully made. She had it cleaned and checked for stability and brought down to the nursery. She also found in the attic a box of children's books, small, old volumes with illustrations in the style of 3 or 4 decades ago, their pages slightly yellowed but perfectly legible. She sat on the attic floor in the August afternoon heat and looked through them one by one. Some of them were clearly meant for very young children, the text simple and the illustrations bright. Some were older stories, the kind she had read herself at 6 or 7. All of them had been read, she could see from the wear on the spines and the soft, slightly rounded corners of the pages. Someone had handled these books many times. She thought about Edmund as a child. She had never seen a painting or drawing of him at a young age, had heard very little about his childhood beyond the bare facts, the older brother Henry, the parents long dead, the inheritance that had come to him in his mid-20s. She could not quite picture him as a child who had sat somewhere in this house and held a book with small hands. The Edmund she knew seemed to have arrived in the world already fully formed and finished, like a house that had been built before you knew it. But the books were real and worn. Someone, somewhere in the history of this house, had sat with a child and read. She brought the box downstairs and added the books to the nursery shelves. In September, Edmund appeared in the doorway of the nursery one afternoon while Cecilia was arranging things on the shelf above the cradle. She heard his step and turned. He stood in the doorway looking at the room with an expression she could not fully read, not cold, but contained, the expression of someone observing something from a slight distance. "The cradle," he said. "I found it in the attic," Cecilia said. "I hope you do not mind, it seems too good to sit unused." Edmund looked at the cradle for a moment longer. "It was mine," he said, "and Henry's before me." "I thought it might be," Cecilia said. She paused. "Did you know there were books up there as well, a whole box of them quite well read?" Edmund was quiet. He looked at the shelf where she had arranged the books, the old spines in a neat row. Something crossed his face that was very brief and very much not the usual careful composure. Something that came and went so quickly that she might have missed it if she had not spent 2 years learning to watch. "My mother's," he said. Then he turned and went back down the corridor, and his footsteps retreated to the east wing, and Cecilia stood in the nursery with the afternoon light coming through the window and thought about the woman who had chosen those books and read them, and handled them enough to soften the corners. She thought about Edmund as a very small child, sitting somewhere in this house with that woman's voice in his ear. She thought about all the things that had happened in these rooms across the years before she arrived, all the love and loss and ordinary daily life that had taken place within these walls, and left no visible trace except a box of books in an attic, and a faint expression on a man's face that came and went in half a second. She sat down in the chair she had placed by the window for night feeding, and looked out at the garden. The oak at the far end of the lawn was already turning. September had arrived with the usual cool authority, the light going golden and thin in the afternoons, the mornings carrying the first serious chill. She had been here now for 2 full years. In that time she had come to know the sound of every room in the house, the particular creak of each stair, the way the east wind came through the gap under the library door and moved the curtains. She had come to know the rhythms of the season in this garden, which flowers appeared first and which trees turned last, where the frost settled earliest and where the snow tended to pile against the fence. She had come to know Mrs. Prout well enough to see through the composure to the tired, watchful woman beneath it. She had come to know Mr. Hatch's careful honesty and his pride in the land. She had come to know the schoolmaster's genuine dedication and the baker in the village who always put an extra roll in when the Duchess's household sent for bread and pretended not to. She had not come to know her husband. but she had over 2 years come to understand him better than he probably realized or would have wanted. She understood his silences and their different qualities, his capability and its limits, the locked door in his character that had its equivalent in the locked door at the end of the West Corridor. She did not hate him, she did not love him. What she felt was something more complicated and more durable than either, a kind of clear-eyed knowledge that included both what he was and what he was not, and that required neither idealization nor contempt. She heard, distantly, the sound of the front door. Edmund leaving, she recognized from the particular weight of it, not the solid close of someone staying but the definite, purposeful shut of someone going somewhere. She sat in the chair and listened to the carriage on the drive. Then the house was quiet again. She put her hand on the side of the old cradle and moved it gently, just enough to set it rocking. The wood was warm under her hand, the grain smooth from years of handling. In a month, perhaps a little more, there would be a child sleeping here. A child who had not yet decided what kind of person to be, who had not yet been shaped by any of the things that shaped people. Entirely new, entirely possible. She kept her hand on the cradle until it stilled. Outside, the oak tree turned. The announcement appeared at breakfast on a Wednesday morning in early September, delivered as Edmund delivered most information, directly, without preamble, between a sip of coffee and a turn of the newspaper page. "I am hosting a gathering in London on the 14th of October, he said. "A private dinner. I will need Baxter and 2 of the footmen. I expect to be in the city from the 11th. Cecilia set down her teacup. She did not raise her voice. She was not a woman who raised her voice. "The 14th, she said. "Yes." She looked at him. He was looking at the newspaper. Outside the dining room window, the early September light was doing something beautiful with the oak tree at the end of the lawn, turning its leaves from green to the first pale yellow at the edges, and Cecilia thought briefly and irrelevantly that she had never in her life so clearly experienced the sensation of 2 things happening at once, the ordinary and the extraordinary, proceeding side by side in perfect indifference to each other. "Edmund," she said, "Dr. Fellows estimates the child will come in mid-October. He has been quite specific about the dates." Edmund turned the page of the newspaper. "You have Annie," he said. 3 words, delivered in the same even tone he brought to everything, the tone of a man for whom decisions were things he made, and then moved on from, the questioning of which was a category of experience he genuinely did not encounter in himself. She looked at him for a long moment. He did not look up. She reached for her teacup. "Yes," she said, "I have Annie." She went through the rest of that day with the specific, focused control of someone who has made a decision about how much of themselves to spend on a given situation. She would not spend herself on this. The decision had been made. It was not hers to unmake. She would direct her energy instead toward the practical. She spoke with Mrs. Prout that afternoon. She told the housekeeper that Edmund would be taking Baxter and 2 footmen to London from the 11th of October. She said this as a plain fact, without commentary, and Mrs. Prout received it as a plain fact, writing it in her household book with the same neat hand she used for every notation. Then Cecilia said, "Mrs. Prout, I would like to discuss the arrangements for the nursery in greater detail, and I would like to be certain that Annie Tull can be reached at any hour of the day or night when the time comes." Mrs. Prout looked up from her book. For just a moment, the briefest possible moment, something passed across her controlled face. Something that was not sympathy exactly, because Mrs. Prout was too careful for sympathy, but was in the same neighborhood as it. "Of course, Your Grace," she said, "I will see to it personally." "Thank you," Cecilia said. She wrote to Annie Tull that evening, a short note explaining the situation plainly and asking if Annie would be willing to be on call from the first week of October. Annie's reply arrived within 2 days, written in the direct, uncomplicated hand Cecilia had come to associate with her. "I will come when you need me. Send word at any hour and I will be there within the half." She folded the note and kept it in her writing table drawer, next to the journal. Over the following weeks, as September advanced and the light grew shorter, and the mornings developed the serious cold of early autumn, Cecilia found herself engaged in a peculiar kind of preparation. She was preparing, on the one hand, for something she had anticipated and planned for over many months, the arrival of her child, which she had thought about carefully and equipped for practically, and was as ready to receive as she could make herself. She was preparing, on the other hand, for something she had not planned and could not fully control, the particular conditions under which that arrival would take place. She thought about this carefully. She was not afraid, she discovered upon examining the feeling closely. Or rather, she was afraid in the way that anyone with full information about what they were about to undertake is afraid, not with panic, but with the steady, honest acknowledgement of a thing's difficulty. She was going to do something very hard in a house with half its usual staff, without her husband, in whatever room and under whatever conditions circumstances decided upon. And she was going to do it with Annie Tull's steady hands and whatever she herself had to bring to the task. She was, she thought, not badly equipped. She spent the first week of October making preparations with Mrs. Prout and Ruth, the lady's maid who had been with her since her arrival at the Hall. Ruth was a steady, practical woman in her mid-30s who had never married and who had transferred, over the 2 years of Cecilia's tenure, a loyalty that had begun as professional duty into something that was considerably warmer than that. Ruth did not speak about this directly, she was too contained for direct declarations, but her loyalty expressed itself in the 100 small attentions she paid to Cecilia's comfort and well-being, the cup of tea that appeared precisely when it was needed, the warm water brought without being asked, the dress chosen with a care that went well beyond the requirements of the position. Edmund left on the morning of the 11th with Baxter and William and George, the 2 most capable footmen. He said goodbye in the entrance hall with the same formal courtesy he brought to all departures and arrivals. He looked at Cecilia with what she now understood was his version of concern, a slightly more focused version of his usual attentiveness, as though he was applying a small amount of additional concentration to the situation. "Send word if you need me," he said. "I will," Cecilia said. She watched the carriage go down the drive, then she went inside, closed the door, and went about her day. The hall was quieter with the reduced staff, but quieter in a way that Cecilia did not find uncomfortable. The essential work continued. Mrs. Prout was not a woman who allowed essential work to be interrupted by anything as minor as a reduced number of footmen, and there was, if anything, a slightly different quality to the atmosphere in those days. Something that might have been called, if you were being generous, warmth. Ruth was more present than usual. The cook, a solid woman named Mrs. Farrow, sent up meals that were slightly more elaborate than necessary, as if extra care in the kitchen was the appropriate response to reduced circumstances elsewhere. The 2 remaining housemaids moved through the house with the particular efficiency of people who are aware that the balance of responsibility has shifted and are responding to it seriously. On the 12th of October, Cecilia woke at 6 in the morning. She lay still for a moment, assessing the quality of what she was feeling with the careful attention she had been taught by Annie Tull to pay to her own body in these final weeks, and then she understood. She did not panic. She dressed herself as far as she was able and rang for Ruth. Ruth appeared at the door in under 3 minutes, already in her day dress. Cecilia suspected she had been sleeping in it or something close to it for the past week. She took one look at Cecilia and said, "I'll send for Annie Tull." "Yes," Cecilia said, "and tell Mrs. Prout." "Already going too," Ruth said, and was gone. Cecilia sat on the edge of the bed and breathed slowly and looked at the window, where the October morning was beginning, pale and cold, the light coming up thin and gray over the garden. She could see the oak from where she sat. Its leaves were fully turned now, golden and deep amber, and some of them were falling as she watched, turning slowly down through the still morning air. She thought about Annie Tull on the road in the early morning cold, coming from the village with her bag. She thought about the 14 days it had taken for this child to decide to arrive, and about the timing of things in general, which she had decided years ago she had very little control over and which she had therefore ceased to argue with. She thought about Edmund at his dinner party in London. She put the thought down. Mrs. Prout came in within minutes, already composed, already in the mode that Cecilia had come to think of as her operational mode, contained, precise, focused. "Annie Tull has been sent for," Mrs. Prout said. "She should be here within the half-hour. Is there anything your Grace needs immediately?" "I am all right," Cecilia said. "For the moment." Mrs. Prout looked at her with that direct, assessing gaze. "You are doing well," she said, and for once the words had a warmth in them that was not quite covered by the professional surface. "Thank you, Mrs. Prout," Cecilia said. She was not in fact doing badly. The early hours of labor were manageable, uncomfortable, demanding her full attention but not the overwhelming experience she had been warned to expect. She walked, as Annie had recommended she do in the early stages, along the corridor outside her room, Ruth beside her, up and down in the quiet of the early morning house. At some point during these early hours, Mrs. Farrow appeared at the foot of the stairs with a tray, warm broth, bread, a small pot of honey. She set it on the hall table without a word and retreated. Cecilia, passing on her next walk, touched the side of the broth pot, still warm. Annie Tull arrived as the clock on the landing showed 7:15. She came in through the front door without ceremony, took one look at Cecilia in the corridor, set down her bag and said, "Good, you're moving, keep moving." She took Cecilia's pulse, asked 3 quick questions and declared herself satisfied with the progress. Then she took off her coat and rolled up her sleeves and took charge. It was, Cecilia would think later, exactly what she had needed. Not sympathy, not alarm, not the fussing uncertainty of someone who did not know what they were doing. Competence. The steady, unhurried competence of someone who had done this many times and knew that the most useful thing in the world in those circumstances was a calm voice and a sure pair of hands. The morning passed. By noon the labor had intensified beyond what Cecilia had been managing with simply walking and breathing, and Annie made the assessment that had a significant practical consequence. The nursery was cold, its fire unlit, the chimneys in the upper west corridor needing the attention that had been deferred since Edmund had taken 2 of the maintenance staff to London with him. Mrs. Prout and Annie conferred in the corridor in low voices. Cecilia, seated in the chair by her bedroom window, heard them without making out the words. Then Mrs. Prout came to her and said, in the same level tone she brought to all communications, "Mrs. Tull recommends moving you to the servants' hall. It is the warmest room in the house at present, with the kitchen fire. She believes it will be better for you and for the child." Cecilia looked at her. Mrs. Prout's expression did not change, but her hands, folded as always, were very still. "Then that is what we shall do," Cecilia said. She was helped down the back stairs by Ruth on one side and the kitchen girl, Dot, on the other. Dot was 17 years old, capable and level-headed beyond her years, and she moved with a steadiness that Cecilia was grateful for. Ruth held her hand the whole way down, and Cecilia could feel in the grip of Ruth's fingers a feeling that was being held very tightly, that was being communicated through that grip instead of through words, and which was, she thought, as good a communication as any she had received in that house. The servants' hall was warm. The kitchen fire had been burning since 5 in the morning, and the heat of it filled the adjacent room with a steady, solid warmth that was entirely unlike the intermittent, performative heat of the formal rooms above. A cot had been brought from the footman's dormitory. Clean linen had appeared, which Cecilia understood without asking was from Mrs. Prout's own reserves, the good linen kept back for occasions requiring it. She lay down. Above her copper pots hung from their hooks. The fire crackled next door. From somewhere outside a bird very early for the season, lost or simply stubborn, was singing. Annie pulled a chair to the bedside and sat down. She did not say anything reassuring. She did not say anything at all. She simply took Cecilia's wrist in her capable hand and sat with her in the warm, ordinary room, and her presence was in itself the thing most needed. The afternoon light moved across the ceiling of the servants' hall in slow, even stripes as the hours passed. Cecilia had not known before this what 14 hours felt like from the inside. Not 14 hours of ordinary life, which passed in the usual mixture of attention and distraction and forward momentum. These hours were different in texture. They were entirely present. They admitted nothing past or future. They demanded everything that was available to be given, and then more than that, and then more again, until the concept of amount became irrelevant and there was simply this, and this, and this. Annie Tull was beside her throughout. Ruth was there too, taking the place each time she was needed, adjusting pillows, bringing water, holding whatever needed holding. Dot tended the fire next door and appeared in the doorway periodically to check, and disappeared again with the quiet efficiency of someone who understood their role precisely. Mrs. Prout came at intervals. Cecilia was aware of her presence at the edge of the room, checking, assessing, disappearing, and each time she came and went, the household machinery kept running. That was Mrs. Prout's gift, and in those hours it was a considerable one. The fire burned steadily, the copper pots hung in their rows, a clock somewhere in the kitchen marked the hours. Annie managed everything with the untroubled authority of someone operating entirely within their area of complete competence. She gave instructions in a low, clear voice and they were followed. She made assessments and communicated them plainly and without dramatizing. When things were going as they should, she said so. When an adjustment was needed, she made it. She did not pray or panic or offer excessive comfort. She offered the better thing, accuracy, the truth of what was happening delivered without alarm. At one point in the deepest hours of the night, Cecilia asked her, "How long?" Annie considered the question with the respect it deserved, not dismissing it, not inflating the answer with false reassurance. "Not yet," she said, "but moving in the right direction. Your body knows what it is doing, Your Grace. It has not forgotten." Cecilia closed her eyes. The fire crackled. Outside the high, small window of the servants' hall, the night was silent and very dark. She thought in those hours of strange things. She thought about the box of books in the attic and the woman who had read them. She thought about Agnes Hartley's letter, "A child will love you without requiring anything that you are not." She thought about the oak tree turning in the garden. She thought about Dot's steady, round face in the doorway, checking. She thought about Mrs. Prout's folded hands and all the things held inside that composure. She thought once about Edmund. The thought arrived and sat for a moment, and she looked at it without bitterness, which surprised her. She felt toward him in that moment something that was not quite pity and not quite understanding, but occupied the space between them, an awareness that he was a person who had made particular choices, and that those choices had particular costs, and that some of those costs were not ones he could even see. Then the thought moved on, and she was back in the room, which was all she could be, which was all she needed to be. At 3 o'clock in the morning of the 13th of October, the child was born. "A boy!" he cried immediately. It was a loud, indignant, entirely decided sound, the cry of someone who had opinions about the conditions of their arrival and was not shy about expressing them. It was the most completely alive sound Cecilia had heard in years, possibly ever. It went into the room, and it went into her chest, and it rearranged something in there that she had not known needed rearranging. Annie placed him in her arms. She looked at him. He looked in the first moments less like a person than like a very recent and vigorous argument for the existence of persons, red-faced, furious, definite. His eyes were scrunched closed, and then briefly, extraordinarily, open, dark and unfocused, aimed at the ceiling of the servants' hall with an expression that could only be described as accusatory. She counted his fingers in the firelight. "All 10. She did this carefully, one by one, touching each small finger with her own, the way you handle something that is both the most fragile and the most durable thing you have ever held. He did not object. He had stopped crying as suddenly as he had started, and now appeared to be conducting his own assessment of the situation. "He is well," Annie said. "He is entirely well." Ruth was crying. Cecilia was aware of this at the edge of her perception, the sound of Ruth's contained, private tears, the ones she was making no effort to stop and would deny later if asked. Dot was in the doorway again, and her young face, visible in the firelight from the kitchen, had an expression on it that was entirely unguarded, the look of a 17-year-old who has just witnessed something she did not have words for yet. Mrs. Prout was in the corner of the room. Cecilia could see her from where she lay. For just a moment in the firelight, Mrs. Prout's face was not composed at all. It was simply the face of a woman who had lived in this house for 23 years and had waited a long time for something like this. Cecilia looked down at the boy. "James," she said. She had been certain of the name for months, in the way you are sometimes certain about things without having a reason to explain. James, not after anyone in particular, just the name that had arrived and settled and was clearly correct. He turned his head fractionally toward the sound of her voice. She felt the full weight of what had happened, not just the physical weight of the child in her arms, though that was considerable and real and entirely present, but the other weight. The fact of him, this person who had not existed and now did, this person who was hers wholly, uncomplicated, without condition. She had spent 2 years learning to survive a house that was technically hers, but felt like someone else's. She had spent 2 years constructing a version of herself that could function within an arrangement that had very little to do with what she needed or wanted. She was still that person, and that person was strong and capable, and not to be underestimated. But this was different. This was hers in the way that nothing in those 2 years had been hers. This small, furious, extraordinary person in the firelight of the servants' hall, in this warm and ordinary room with the copper pots above and the women around her who had stayed through all of it, was hers in a way that required no title, no arrangement, no formally signed settlement. He had simply arrived and become hers, and that was a fact of the world now. She held him through the rest of the night. Annie settled matters with the thorough efficiency of her profession, and then sat back in her chair and closed her own eyes, not quite sleeping, not quite not sleeping, present in the way she had been present for the whole 14 hours, available without interrupting. Ruth slept in the corner chair, her head tilted back, still holding a cloth she had been using. Dot went back to the kitchen and built up the fire. The night passed in a quality of quiet that was unlike the silences Cecilia had learned in this house. Those silences had always had a texture to them, the silence of locked doors and careful distances, the silence of things unspoken. This silence was different. It was simply quiet. The quiet of a room where people had worked hard and now rested, where a fire burned and a child slept, and the night moved toward morning at its usual unhurried pace. At 5 in the morning, Cecilia was still awake. She had not slept. She was not tired, or rather she was tired in a way that was so thorough it had moved beyond tiredness into something else, a kind of profound, cleanly lit wakefulness. She lay with James against her in the warm room and looked at the ceiling and thought carefully about what the next days would look like and what would need to be done. A telegram would need to be sent to London. She thought about this practically, without heat. Edmund would need to know. James was his heir. Whatever else was complicated between them, that was straightforward. She was aware, thinking about this, of a very quiet, very clear anger, not the big dramatic anger of confrontation. Something smaller and more durable, the kind that lives not in scenes but in the incremental adjustment of how you regard a person. She had known for 2 years what Edmund was and what their arrangement was. But there was something about this night, about the 14th of October, about a dinner party in London, about the copper pots and Ruth's quiet tears and Annie Tull's steady hands, that added a layer to that knowing that she understood would not wear away. She did not send the telegram herself. She told Mrs. Prout in the morning, when Mrs. Prout came to check on them, and Mrs. Prout sent it from the village in her own good time, which was mid-morning. Edmund was informed of the birth of his son while he sat at dinner in a London house, between the fish course and the roast. Cecilia did not know the exact circumstances. She learned the broad outline later, through the kind of quiet information transfer that moves through households, through servants and their networks, and the small, specific details that travel along those channels with remarkable precision. She learned that a footman brought the telegram on a salver, that Edmund read it at the table, that he said "a boy" and set the telegram beside his wine glass, that the dinner continued. She absorbed this information with the same steady attention she had applied to everything else. She did not find it surprising. She found it instead confirming, adding itself to the long, detailed account she had been quietly assembling for 2 years of what Edmund Hargrove was and was not. She was in the morning room when he arrived on the 15th, 2 days after the birth. She had moved from the servants' hall back to the upper floor on the morning of the 14th, and had been walking by afternoon, slowly, carefully, with Annie's approval, and had conducted a brief session with Mrs. Prout on the 14th evening about several small household matters that needed attention. On the 15th morning she dressed, with Ruth's help, in one of her day dresses, and went downstairs and sat in the morning room with James in her arms in the chair by the window. Mrs. Prout had set the room in order as she always did, the fire going, the morning light coming through the clear glass, the faint sound of the garden below. She heard the carriage on the drive. She heard the front door. She heard Baxter's voice, and then Edmund's and his step in the hall, and then the step on the stair, and then the morning room door opening. Edmund came in. He looked as he always did, entirely himself, composed, straight-backed, measured. He looked at Cecilia. He looked at the child in her arms. And then Cecilia did something she had not planned and had not consciously decided on. She did not stand. In 2 years of marriage she had always stood when Edmund entered a room she was in. It was habit, reflex, the embedded behavior of a woman raised to rise for a duke. She had done it automatically, every time, without thought. She did not stand. She remained seated, in the chair by the window, with James in her arms, and she looked at Edmund with an expression that was entirely calm and entirely clear. Edmund stopped. For just a moment she saw him notice it, the absence of the automatic rising. He did not say anything about it. He came forward instead and looked at the child in her arms. "He is well," he said. "He is very well," Cecilia said. "He arrived on the 13th, 2 days ago." "Good," Edmund said. He looked at James with the complex, guarded attention he brought to things he did not quite know how to approach. "He is healthy." "Entirely," Cecilia said. "Good," Edmund said again. He straightened. He looked at Cecilia. She held his gaze, and something passed between them in that brief exchange that neither of them had words for. Edmund looked away first. He said he would be in his study if anything was needed, and he left the room with his usual measured step. Cecilia looked down at James. He was asleep. He slept with the total, uncompromising commitment of someone who had decided that sleep was the current project and had no interest in anything else. His hands were curled loosely near his face. His breathing was small and even. She put her cheek close to the top of his head and stayed there for a moment. Outside the window, the oak tree had lost most of its leaves now. The remaining ones turned slowly in a faint morning wind, gold against the pale October sky, and one by one, unhurried, they let go. The telegram boy from Ashwell village was 14 years old, and he had delivered many telegrams in his years of service, and he knew, with the particular sensitivity of people whose job requires them to carry messages without reading them, that some telegrams were important and some were not. This one, he had been told by the postmistress who sent him off with it, was important. It was going to an address in Mayfair, London, which was a long way from Ashwell, Gloucestershire, but the postmistress had placed it on the wire to the London Exchange that morning with unusual briskness, and it had arrived at the Mayfair address by the early evening of the 13th. The boy in London who delivered it from the Exchange to the door was a different boy entirely, but he handed it to the footman, who answered with the same careful manner that these boys shared across the country, the manner of people who carried information they were not supposed to have feelings about. The footman brought it into the dining room on a silver tray. The dinner at the house in Mayfair had been proceeding for approximately 40 minutes. There were 6 people at the table. Edmund sat at the head. Dorothea Fane sat at the position that, in a different arrangement, would have been his wife's. The other guests were a man named George Alderton, a barrister whom Edmund had known since university, and his wife, Caroline, and a couple recently returned from a posting abroad, the husband a diplomat, the wife someone whose name Edmund had forgotten by the fish course. The food was good, the wine was better. The conversation had settled into the particular register of people who know each other well enough to stop trying, who have moved past the social performance of dinner parties and arrived at something more genuinely pleasant, the trading of opinions on things that actually interested them, the kind of talk that reminded Edmund periodically why he maintained his London arrangements at all. He was, at the moment the footman appeared with the silver tray, in the middle of a conversation with George Alderton about a land case in the county courts that both of them had opinions on. He broke off when the tray was presented. He looked at the envelope. He picked it up, opened it with the small silver knife the footman had helpfully provided, and read it. He set it down beside his wine glass. "A boy," he said. George Alderton raised his glass. The diplomat's wife said, "Congratulations, Edmund, how wonderful." Caroline Alderton asked with genuine warmth if the Duchess was well, and Edmund said yes, she was well and the boy was healthy. Someone proposed a toast. Edmund raised his glass. The dinner continued. The fish course made way for the roast. The conversation moved on as conversations do. At no point in the evening did Edmund say he needed to leave. At no point did he ask for his coat, or send a message to the station, or suggest that the assembled company would understand if he departed early. He sat at his table in his London house, and ate his roast and drank his wine and talked about the land case with George Alderton, and about the European situation with the diplomat, and about the management of a garden in Berkshire with Caroline Alderton, who had opinions on the subject. It was not precisely that he did not care. Edmund Hargrove was not a man who did not care about things. He was a man who cared about certain things in certain ways, and whose way of caring about the birth of his son appeared to be to acknowledge it at the dinner table and continue with the dinner. Dorothea Fane said very little during the toast. She raised her glass. She looked at Edmund with an expression that was complex and not entirely readable, the expression of a woman who has been in a situation for long enough to have complicated feelings about it. She drank her wine. She was not a woman without conscience. This was something she had long since made her peace with, in the way that people make peace with their own contradictions, not by resolving them, but by learning to live alongside them without constant disruption. She knew what she was. She knew what the arrangement was. She had known Edmund for 6 years, since they had met at a dinner not unlike this one, and found in each other a kind of mutual recognition that was difficult to explain, and that had clearly proved difficult to end. She thought about Cecilia sometimes. She had met her only once, that visit to the hall in October of 1868, That one dinner with the woman who had sat across the table and watched with her clear, intelligent eyes and had not missed anything. Dorothea had known from the first moment that she was not being fooled by. Cecilia Vane had taken the full measure of the situation and had chosen, for reasons of her own, to continue the dinner conversation with perfect composure, and Dorothea had found this simultaneously admirable and not without complication. The dinner ended, the guests departed, the house settled into the quiet of late evening. Edmund sat for a while in the room that served as his study when he was in London. He sat in the good leather chair by the window and looked at the street below, where the occasional carriage still moved, and at the gas lamps making their yellow circles on the pavement, and he thought about his son. He was thinking not precisely about James. He did not yet have enough information about James to think specifically about him, but about the fact of James. The fact that there was now in the hall a person who would inherit all of this, the house and the land and the name and the whole complicated weight of what it meant to be a Hargrove. He thought about this with the mixture of satisfaction and gravity that men of his position were raised to bring to questions of succession, the sense that the thing had been accomplished that needed to be accomplished. He thought briefly about Cecilia. He thought about her sitting in that house with half the staff, with Annie Tull and Mrs. Prout and Ruth, doing what needed to be done in the particular competent, uncomplaining way she did everything. He thought about the nursery she had prepared, the books from the attic, the cradle she had found and brought down. He thought about her face at breakfast every morning, arranged in its pleasant expression that told him nothing and covered everything. He was not even now particularly good at asking himself the more direct questions. He had been formed in a way that made such questions difficult to access. The part of him that might have said, "I should go back, she is alone, I am the cause of her aloneness. This is not a thing I should be comfortable with," that part existed, somewhere in there. But it was not loud, and the dinner had been good, and the wine had been very good, and the conversation had been the kind of conversation he found in London and nowhere else. He sat for a while longer. Then he went to bed. He remained in London for another day. He had matters to see to. This was not simply a story, he told himself. There were genuinely matters in the city that needed his attention. He saw his solicitor on the morning of the 14th. He visited his club in the afternoon. He attended a meeting about a business investment he was considering. These were real things. But he did not rush. He did not wake on the morning of the 14th and find himself impatient to be on the road to Gloucestershire, to be back at the hall, to see this child who was his son. He moved through the day at his usual measured pace, and on the morning of the 15th he packed his things and told Baxter to prepare the carriage. The journey back to Ashwell took the better part of the day. Edmund sat in the carriage and read papers and watched the countryside shift from the grey density of the city to the open fields of the West Country, the land getting bigger and emptier as the miles passed. He had made this journey many times and he knew its stages, the particular village that meant the last third, the hill where you could see the church tower at Ashwell, the long final straight of the drive. He arrived at the hall in the late afternoon. Baxter opened the carriage door. Edmund stepped out into the October air, which was cold and clean in the specific way of Gloucestershire autumn, and looked up at the front of the house for a moment. The lights were on in the morning room. He went inside. Cecilia was in the chair by the window. She had James in her arms. She did not stand. He registered this. He did not comment on it. He came forward and looked at the child and asked his questions, and listened to her answers and said good, good, and looked at his son again with that complex, guarded attention, and then he straightened and said he would be in his study. He went to his study and sat at his desk, and looked at the papers that Mrs. Prout had arranged there in his absence. He did not open them immediately. He sat for a moment with his hands flat on the desk, looking at the middle distance with the expression that his family, had any of them been there to see it, might have recognized as the expression he wore when he was aware, somewhere beneath the usual management of himself, that something had shifted and he was not yet certain what. In the morning room, his wife was sitting in the window chair with his son, and she had not stood when he came in, and this small, quiet fact sat in the room with him like a very patient question. He opened the papers. He did not answer the question. He was not, as yet, in the habit of it. But something had been said, in that moment in the morning room, said without words, in the language of a woman who had been paying attention for 2 years and had decided, in the particular circumstance of the servants' hall and the copper pots and the 14 hours and the 2 days before anyone arrived, that she was going to hold her ground a little differently from now on. He had heard it. Even men who do not listen very carefully hear the things that are said this plainly. He reviewed his papers. The afternoon light moved across his desk. From somewhere in the house, from the morning room or from the direction of the stairs, he heard very faintly the sound of a child crying, and then more faintly still the sound of a woman's voice, low and steady, talking, not to the house, not to the silence, to the child. He turned a page. He continued reading. Ruth Mayfield had a sister in Bristol named Clara who worked as a seamstress, and who received, in November of 1869, a letter that was 12 pages long. Clara kept the letter. She did not fully understand at the time why she kept it. She kept most of Ruth's letters. They had been writing to each other since childhood, but this one she kept differently in a separate place, folded very carefully, handled with a delicacy that Clara could not entirely explain. She read it several times in the weeks after it arrived. Then she put it away. It was not until 1902, when a Bristol journalist named Norman Pearce was writing a piece on the history of the great houses of Gloucestershire, and had come to Clara's door on a neighbor's recommendation, that she told him about the letter. She did not show it to him. She was not ready, perhaps, to release it entirely into the world, but she told him what was in it. Ruth had written the letter, Clara told him, 3 weeks after the birth of the young heir at Hargrove Hall. She had written it because she needed to tell someone, and she had written it to Clara because Clara was the person she told things to. She had written it in full, the departure of the Duke and the reduced staff, the overnight labor, the decision to move to the servants' hall, the copper pots, the 14 hours, the moment at 3 in the morning when the boy arrived, and Ruth had found herself unable to stop crying. What she had wanted Clara to know above all was this, that throughout all of it the Duchess had not once asked for the Duke. Not in the early hours when she was still walking the corridor and might easily have said, if she had wanted to, why did he not stay, or where is Edmund, or even simply he should be here. Not in the worst hours when she needed everything she had and still had to find more. Not at the end when the boy was in her arms and the question of his father's whereabouts was simply a fact of the air in the room. She had asked for water, Ruth wrote. She had asked for someone to keep talking to her so she would not feel alone. She had said Annie's name several times, always specifically and correctly, never in the vague calling-out way of someone who does not know who they are calling for. She had said please and thank you at moments when Ruth was quite sure she would not have thought of it herself. She had not asked for the Duke. Ruth did not write this as an accusation. She was too careful for that, too aware of the precise territory of her position. But the letter conveyed, in the careful language of a woman writing what she had witnessed without quite daring to editorialize, a clear picture. The picture of a woman managing on her own in circumstances that did not require managing on her own, who managed anyway with her whole self applied to it, and emerged from it with something that Ruth could only describe as more herself than she had been going in. Clara kept the letter. The journalist made notes. The piece he wrote was careful and general, as pieces about the great houses tended to be, not naming anything directly that could create difficulties for anyone still living. But in the course of his research, Norman Pearce also spoke to several other people in the village of Ashwell, and what he gathered from those conversations confirmed and extended what Clara had told him. Annie Tull he found living in the village in comfortable retirement, at 72, still sharp and still direct. She was initially reluctant to speak about the hall. She had a professional reticence that ran deep, but Pearce was a patient interviewer, and he had by this point enough of the outline that Annie's confirmation was less about new information and more about truthfulness in a record that she felt mattered. She told him about the night, not the personal details, those she held to herself, but the structural facts. The reduced staff, the cold rooms, the decision she had made about the servants' hall, the warmth of the kitchen fire, and the efficiency of Mrs. Prout and the steadiness of young Dot, who had tended that fire for 14 hours without complaint. She said, and Pearce wrote this down, she was the bravest patient I have attended in 30 years, not because she did not feel what she felt, because she felt all of it and still did not waste a moment of it. Pearce asked what she meant by waste. Annie thought about this. She was the kind of woman who thought before she spoke and who said precisely what she meant when she spoke. Some women in those hours, she said, spend themselves on fear or anger or grief. There are things to fear and be angry about and grieve. But she spent herself on the matter at hand. Every bit of her was on what needed doing. I have rarely seen anything like it in a person of any station. Pearce asked if she had expected that. I had expected strength, Annie said. I had not known the kind. Pierce's article ran in the Bristol Evening Post in October of 1902, 33 years after the events it described. It was careful, it was respectful, and it was specific enough that people who knew the relevant households understood exactly what it was about. Edmund Hargrove was 21 years dead by then, which simplified the question of legal consequence. There was a third source. Harper, who had been Dorothy Parker in 1869 and had worked in the kitchen at Hargrove Hall from the age of 15, until she married a farmer from the next parish and left at 20, was by 1902 Dorothy Harper, mother of 4 and grandmother of 2, living in a farmhouse 7 miles from Ashwell with roses on the gate and strong opinions about most things. Pierce found her through the village postmistress, who had grown up knowing Dot and mentioned her name in the context of anyone who had been at the hall during the relevant years. He arrived at the farmhouse on a Tuesday afternoon and was given tea and a piece of excellent seed cake and the full, unedited account of a woman who had spent 30 years telling herself it was not her place to speak and had now, at 51, revised this position. She told Pierce about the fire. She told him about the broth she had carried up and left on the hall table without being asked, because she had thought it might be needed, and no one had told her it was not her job to think that. She told him about sitting in the kitchen through the night, keeping the fire, listening to the house around her. She told him about standing in the doorway periodically to check that things were all right, because she needed to know and also because she had the feeling. She was a practical woman, not a sentimental one, but she had this feeling that it was important for someone to be present, even in a doorway, even 17 years old. She told Pierce one thing that Ruth had not mentioned in her letter and that Annie had not said in the interview. She told him about the moment, close to dawn, when she had brought more wood for the fire and paused in the doorway on her way back out, and had seen the Duchess sitting very still with the boy in her arms. The room was quiet. Annie was resting in her chair. Ruth was asleep. And the Duchess was just sitting there, holding the child, and looking at him with an expression that Dot, at 17, had not had the experience to fully name, but that she had thought about many times in the 30 years since. She looked, Dot told Pierce, choosing her words with care, like a person who had arrived somewhere, not a place she had been going to, just somewhere real, where she actually was. Pierce wrote all of this down. He asked Dot if she thought the Duchess had been unhappy. Dot considered this at length. She ate a piece of her own seed cake. She looked out the window at the roses on the gate, which were past their season and going brown at the edges. I think she was unhappy about some things, Dot said at last, same as most people. But in that room that night she was not unhappy. She was all there, all of herself right there in that room, and the baby was there, and we were all there, and I thought it was one of the truest things I had ever seen. Pierce's article was well received. It was reprinted in a London paper and discussed in several letters columns, where the question of what exactly it meant for the events of October 1869 to be set down in print generated considerable correspondence. Most of the correspondents agreed that the article was remarkable. Some argued it was overdue. A few argued it should not have been written at all, on grounds that were less about the truth of it and more about the discomfort of having the truth in print. Ruth Mayfield, by then long retired from service and living with Clara in Bristol, read the article when Clara sent it to her. She read it twice. She wrote a note to Pierce through the newspaper, a short and careful note which said only, "The account you have published is accurate and I am grateful it has been published." Annie Tull read it and said nothing, which was her way of approving of something completely. Harper sent copies to all 4 of her children. What none of the 3 women spoke about publicly, in the article or in private correspondence, was what each of them had felt individually during those 14 hours. They had been professional about it, Ruth in the way of a good lady's maid, Annie in the way of a skilled midwife, Dot in the way of a girl who understood that her job was to tend the fire and be present. But each of them had been something else as well, something that was not professional, that was not about their role or their position. Each of them had been a woman, watching another woman do something very hard, alone, in a warm room in the middle of the night, without the person who should have been there. Each of them had known, without needing to say it, that this was not how it should have been. And each of them had decided, without discussing it, to stay, to be the thing that was there. To be the company, the warm hands, the fire, the broth on the hall table, the voice talking so she would not feel alone. This was not in the article, it did not need to be. It was the thing that was done and not said, which is sometimes the more enduring kind. The journalist's papers when he died in 1921 included his original notes from the 3 interviews, written in a shorthand that his widow eventually had transcribed. The transcription was donated to the County Historical Society in 1924. It was catalogued as Item 1147 in the Gloucestershire collection and remained there, in its cardboard box with its label written in a librarian's neat hand, for many decades. Anyone who knew what they were looking for could find it. A few people did. By the spring of 1873, Cecilia Vane had been the Duchess of Ashwell for 5.5 years, and she had learned, with the thoroughness of someone who had no alternative but to learn well, exactly what was required to live in this house and not be consumed by it. James was 3 years old and had opinions about almost everything. He had opinions about his shoes, which he preferred not to wear. He had opinions about the morning routine, which he experienced as an imposition. He had opinions about the garden, which he found endlessly interesting, and about the library, where he had twice dismantled the lower shelves in the interest of what he described, to no one in particular, as a better arrangement. He had opinions, loudly and specifically expressed, about food, whether visitors' hats, the dog belonging to the gamekeeper, the color of particular rooms, and the schedule of his own naps, which he considered optional. Cecilia found him, without reservation, the most wonderful thing she had ever known. She spent mornings with him. This was not, among the women of her class, the universal practice. There were nursemaids for that, which was the point of nursemaids, but Cecilia had arranged the mornings so that she was there. She read to him from the books she had brought down from the attic, from the old volumes that had been his grandmother's, from newer books she had ordered specifically for him. He was not yet reading himself, but he sat with a focused, energetic attention when she read aloud, asking questions at irregular intervals that were so precisely aimed at the thing she had just said that she had taken to marking her place carefully so she could go back. She talked to him about everything, about the garden and the weather and the names of the trees and the way bread was made, and where the water in the tap came from and why the sky was sometimes gray and sometimes blue and what it meant when the leaves changed color. He asked questions she could not always answer, at which point she said so and they went to find out together, which he appeared to find entirely satisfying as an approach. Edmund's relationship with his son was less involved and not unkind. He saw James at dinner occasionally, when Cecilia brought him down for a brief evening visit, and Edmund would speak to him with a measured, courteous attention, asking him questions, listening to the answers with the concentrated focus he brought to most things. James regarded his father with the unself-conscious interest of a small child who has not yet developed the social filters that would tell him what to make of the distant, pewter-eyed man who lived in the East Wing and was apparently very important. "He doesn't play," James informed Cecilia one morning with the tone of someone making an objective observation. "He only asks questions." "Some people are better at questions than playing," Cecilia said. "Both are useful." James considered this with the suspicious look of someone not entirely convinced. Then he moved on to his next project, which involved the systematic examination of every stone in the garden wall. The arrangement between Cecilia and Edmund had settled by 1873 into something that functioned. They were civil at dinner and in the hallways, and at the occasional social occasion they attended together. Edmund managed the estate in the broad sense. Cecilia managed the household in the day-to-day sense, with a thoroughness and capability that had by now completely superseded Mrs. Prout's original role as the person who knew how things ran. This was not contested. Mrs. Prout had watched the transition with something that might have been relief here, finally, was someone who took the house seriously on its own terms, who cared about it not as an obligation but as an endeavor. Cecilia took James to Devon in April of 1873. She had made this decision in February, sitting at her writing table on a cold afternoon with the window showing the winter garden and James asleep upstairs, and the house very quiet around her. She had been corresponding with her mother for months about a possible visit, the kind of visit she had been meaning to make, and had not made since the first year of her marriage. Her mother's letters had become, over the years, warmer and more direct, as though the distance of correspondence had freed her from some of the social performance that in-person life required. She told Edmund at dinner one evening that she intended to take James to visit her parents in Devon for a period of approximately 4 months, beginning in April. Edmund looked up from his plate. 4 months, he said. Yes, Cecilia said, James should know his other grandparents, and I should like to spend time with my mother." There was a pause of the particular kind that Cecilia had learned to read as Edmund, considering something he was not sure he had grounds to object to and looking to see whether grounds existed. They apparently did not. "As you wish," he said. She thanked him. She ate her dinner. She noticed without comment that the permission she had technically asked for was unnecessary. She had the right to visit her parents, the right to take her child on a visit, the right to determine the length of the visit. She had asked in the form she had because it was the form that caused least disruption. But she was aware, as she ate her dinner, that the question of forms was one she was increasingly impatient with. She wrote to her mother that evening. The letter was 2 pages and warm and specific, full of practical arrangements, and also something that was not quite possible to put in a letter about the day Edmund left with the footmen and the overnight labor and the servants' hall and the copper pots. But that was present between the lines of the practical arrangements, in the way that things are present when the person reading knows the writer well enough. Her mother wrote back within 4 days. The letter was 5 pages. It was the most direct letter Eleanor Vane had ever written to her daughter in the 17 years of her adult life, and it said, in the particular language of a mother who had watched a situation from a distance and carried the knowledge carefully for a long time, that she was glad they were coming, that she had been waiting, that Devon in the spring was beautiful, and that she had made up the east bedroom for Cecilia with the window that looked toward the sea. They arrived in Devon on the 6th of April. Cecilia's parents met them at the station, her mother already stepping forward before the carriage had fully stopped, her father slightly behind her, looking at his daughter and his grandson with an expression Cecilia had never quite seen on his face before, something that was attempting composure and not entirely achieving it. James went immediately to his grandmother with the confidence of a child who has heard someone talked about warmly enough to feel they are already known. Eleanor Vane received this with a joy that was entirely unguarded, bending to his level and talking to him with the full attention of someone who had been waiting for precisely this. George Vane watched from a few feet back, and then Cecilia was beside him, and he said, "You look well," in a voice that was trying to be his usual voice and was not quite managing it, and she said, "I am well, Papa," and leaned her head against his arm for a moment, and he put his hand briefly on her hair the way he had not done since she was a child. The 4 months in Devon were the most genuinely restful time Cecilia had experienced since her marriage. Her parents' house was warm and comfortable and full of the particular quality of a place where people had lived for a long time and had made it genuinely theirs. The rooms accumulated and personal, the garden both tended and slightly wild, the smell of the sea in every breeze. James discovered the sea. His response to it was total and instantaneous. He stood at the top of the cliff path on the first morning and looked at the water with an expression of such pure astonishment that Cecilia reached for her journal and tried to describe it and found, for one of the few times in her years of journaling, that words were not quite adequate to the thing. He asked questions about the sea for 3 weeks. He wanted to know where it went when it went out and where it came from when it came back. He wanted to know what was at the bottom. He wanted to know why it was that color and whether the fish could see and what happened to them when the water was rough. He collected stones from the beach with the systematic thoroughness of an experienced collector, bringing them back to the house in his pockets, and arranging them in rows on his windowsill according to a classification system that he understood and that Cecilia was still working out. She watched him and felt in the watching the clearest version of the feeling that had first arrived in the servants' hall on the morning of October 13th, that particular weight, that particular clarity. He was hers. Whatever else was complicated about her life, this was not. This was simply true and real and present, the most solid fact in her world. She wrote to Agnes Hartley from Devon, a long letter covering the past several months. Agnes wrote back with the warm, clear-eyed intelligence Cecilia had relied on for years. She said, "You are doing something very difficult, and the reason you are managing is that you have not tried to do it in the way other people would expect you to. You are doing it in the only way that actually works, which is your way." Cecilia read this several times. In June, a letter arrived from Edmund. It was brief and practical, a question about a matter at the hall that required a decision she was better placed to make than he was, given her more recent involvement with a particular supplier. She wrote back with the answer. The exchange was perfectly civil. It was also, she noted, exactly what it was: 2 people managing a shared enterprise with reasonable efficiency and no particular warmth. She thought about this more in Devon than she had allowed herself to think about it in the hall. The hall had a way of keeping you busy with its own requirements, its daily demands and rhythms that filled the days before you could turn too much attention to the underlying structure. Devon gave her mornings with nothing in them but the sound of the sea and James's voice asking questions and the light coming through the east window. She thought about her marriage. She thought about what it had been and what it currently was and what, realistically, it could become. She was 27 years old. She was healthy and capable and more competent than anyone in the relevant positions had expected her to be when she arrived at Hargrove Hall as a 22-year-old bride with 4 months of courtship behind her. She had built in those 5 years something real and functional and genuinely hers, a role in the household, a connection to the village and the school and the land, a relationship with her son that was the best thing in her life. She had Agnes and her mother's letters and Annie Tull's periodic visits and the walks every morning in whatever season offered them. She had, in other words, a life. It was not the life she had imagined, and it was not the life she would have chosen if choices had been available. But it was a real life, and it was hers, and it had more in it than she sometimes gave it credit for. But she was 27 years old, and she was sitting with a view of the sea, and she was honest enough to admit that what she had was not enough. Not devastating, not unsurvivable, but not enough. She wrote to a solicitor in Bath in July. The letter was careful, specific, and addressed to the question of the marriage settlement, the document her father had negotiated before the wedding, the one that outlined her financial arrangements and her legal position within the marriage. She asked for a clear explanation of what she was and was not entitled to. The solicitor, a man named William Garfield who had been recommended by Agnes, wrote back within a fortnight with a thorough and unambiguous response. She read it twice, she put it in the back of her journal, she looked out at the sea. Then Edmund's letter arrived, the brief one about the supplier, and she wrote back the answer, and she let the question of the solicitor settle at the back of her mind where things settled when they were not yet ready to be decided. She was gathering information. She was doing what she had done since the beginning, paying attention, assembling the picture, not acting before she understood what she was acting toward. She was clear with herself about this, making a decision. She was building the knowledge she would need when a decision became necessary. In September, she returned to the hall. Edmund received them in the entrance hall. He looked at James with the focused attention he brought to his son's visits, and James looked at him with the frank, curious interest of a child who is always in the process of collecting data. "I can swim," James told his father. "Grandmama says I am a natural." "That is good," Edmund said. "The sea is very big," James added, in case this was relevant. "It is," Edmund said. "Did you know what was at the bottom?" Edmund looked at him. "No," he said, "do you?" James thought about this. "I am still finding out," he said. Edmund looked at his son for a moment with the expression that came and went quickly, and that Cecilia had learned to recognize as the most unguarded thing he ever showed, something that was, perhaps, the thinnest edge of an emotion that had no comfortable place in the life he had built. "Good," he said. "It is worth finding out." They went in to dinner. The hall was the same as she had left it. Mrs. Prout was as reliable as sunrise. Mr. Hatch had left a summary of the summer's agricultural results on her desk. The school had sent a letter asking if the Duchess would resume her visits, which she had intended to do anyway. The garden had produced in her absence a spectacular quantity of apples. She sat in the morning room on the first evening back, with James asleep upstairs and the house quiet around her and the autumn dark settling over the grounds. She had her journal open. She had been writing for half an hour. She stopped and looked at the page. She had written without planning to, "I am not the same person who arrived here in 1867. I am not sure that person would entirely recognize me. I think she would be relieved." She looked at this for a while. Then she wrote, "I think she would be proud." Edmund Hargrove died on the 3rd of March, 1881, in a house in Belgravia. The news reached Hargrove Hall at 8:30 in the morning, by telegram, delivered by the same route that most significant news came to the hall, the village telegraph office, the boy on the road, the door, the silver tray. Mrs. Prout received it. She brought it to Cecilia in the morning room, where Cecilia was reading the day's correspondence and James, now 11 years old, was finishing his breakfast at the table in the corner, working through a problem in mathematics with the absorbed focus he brought to anything that offered resistance. Cecilia read the telegram. She set it on the table beside her cup. She looked at the window for a moment, at the morning garden with its March frost still white on the grass, the sky the pale, clear color of early spring. Then she looked at James. He had noticed the telegram and the quality of her stillness, and was watching her with the intelligence that had always been the most reliable thing about him. He did not say anything. He waited with a patience that was, she sometimes thought, the most remarkable thing about her son, his ability to wait for the actual information instead of filling the space with noise. "Your father has died," she said. Her voice was even. She had not planned how to say this, but the evenness came as it usually came in the moments that required it most. James was quiet for a moment. He looked at the table. He said, "Was it sudden?" "Yes," she said, "I believe so." He nodded slowly. He was working through it. She could see him working through it. With that same absorbed focus he brought to the mathematics problem, turning the fact over and finding its weight. He had not been close to his father. He had not been distant from him. The relationship had existed in the careful, civil middle ground that was Edmund's natural register with most people, and James had learned, as children do, to exist within the shape that was offered. "Are you all right?" he asked. The question surprised her. Not that he asked it. James had always been a person who asked the right question, but the directness of it, the way it was aimed at her rather than at himself, at 11 years old in the first minute after learning of his father's death. "Yes," she said honestly. "I am all right." He nodded again. Then he said, "I am going to go for a walk," and she said yes, that seemed like a good idea, and he put on his coat and his boots and went out into the March morning. She watched him from the window, crossing the frost-pale lawn toward the kitchen garden. He walked with his hands in his pockets and his head slightly down, the walk of someone thinking seriously. The oak at the far end of the lawn was bare still, the buds barely beginning, the branches making their precise lines against the clear sky. She sat with the telegram on the table beside her teacup for a long time. She did not cry. She did not feel, examining her own responses with the honesty she had always tried to bring to that exercise, the grief that she understood she was supposed to feel. What she felt was more complicated and less simple than grief, a kind of weight that was not quite sadness, not quite relief, not quite the closure she had read about in other women's accounts of widowhood. It was, she thought, the particular weight of finality. The ending of something that had been its particular shape for 14 years, and would now be a different shape. She thought about Edmund. She thought about his composed face and his measured voice and the pewter eyes that were occasionally, in the right light, the eyes of someone with much more interior life than he ever expressed. She thought about the evening at the hall after Dorothea Fane's first visit, and the box of books in the attic, and the cradle that had been his and Henry's before him, and the brief, unguarded expression on his face when he had looked at it. She thought about the 2 words he had said in the nursery, "my mother's," and the thing that had come and gone so quickly in his face. She thought about Dorothea Fane. She had known from the form of the telegram that Edmund had died in London. She had known, because she knew the shape of his arrangements and had known it for years, that he was not alone. She did not know yet the specific address, though she would learn it in the following days as the necessary practical information came through. She knew what she knew. She felt, thinking about this, something that was not quite anger and not quite pity. It was more like a long familiar understanding arriving at its final statement. He had chosen a life and he had lived it as he chose it, and now it was over. He had been a man who contained a great deal that he never opened. He had had, for what it was worth, the company he most valued for the last years of his life. And he had had a son who was remarkable and a house well managed and an estate properly cared for, and these were things that she had made possible, and he had never, to her knowledge, understood that. This was the one thing she allowed herself to feel the full weight of, not betrayal, that required expectations she had lost before they could properly form. Not rage, she was too honest about the shape of the thing for a rage that pretended surprise, but the simple, clear fact of it, that she had made all of this possible and that he had not seen it. She let that sit. Then she set it down. She had work to do. The practical requirements of the following weeks were considerable, and Cecilia met them with the same focused efficiency she had always brought to the hall's management. Edmund's brother Henry came from Derbyshire, with Beatrice, and the warmth between Cecilia and Beatrice after 12 years was the genuine warmth of 2 people who had always liked each other and had not managed enough time together. Beatrice made herself useful in the completely uncomplicated way of someone who simply identifies what is needed and does it. and her presence through the difficult early weeks was something Cecilia was grateful for in a way that was difficult to express and unnecessary too. The solicitor handled the estate matters with the particular efficiency of a firm that had been managing the Hargrove affairs for 3 generations and knew every document in the relevant collections. The estate passed to James, as had always been the arrangement, and Cecilia's position as his regent, in all but the formal use of that word, since the formal mechanisms were those of a mother managing an heir's minority, was clear. The settlement her father had negotiated in 1867, the one she had had William Garfield explain to her in July of 1873 sitting with a view of the Devon Sea, was what it was. She was protected, she was provided for, she was not dependent on anyone's goodwill. She had known this for 8 years, it was good to have it confirmed. James, at 11, took his inheritance with the seriousness of a boy who had been paying attention to the world around him for long enough to understand what it meant. He sat with Cecilia in the estate office the week after the funeral and went through the accounts with her, not passively, not as a child being shown things, but with actual questions, the right questions, aimed at the things that were not obvious. He had been in and out of this office since he was old enough to follow her down the stairs, and he had absorbed, without formal instruction, a working knowledge of how the estate functioned. "Mr. Hatch says the south field needs drainage," he said, looking at the relevant column. "Yes," Cecilia said, "it has been discussed for 2 years. Is it very expensive?" "It is, but the cost of not doing it is accumulating faster." James looked at the numbers for a moment. "Then we should do it," he said. She looked at him across the desk. 11 years old, with his father's straight back and his own intelligence and the particular quality of certainty that had always been his, the clear-eyed assessment that did not perform more confidence than it had. "Yes," she said. "We should." The drainage was arranged. The winter passed. Spring came to the hall with its usual abundance, the gardens doing what they always did, the kitchen garden producing its surplus, the apple trees in the old orchard coming into blossom with a pink and white extravagance that James climbed through when he thought she wasn't watching. She wrote to Annie Tull. They had been in correspondence since James's birth, a regular, warm exchange that had moved, over the years, from the professional toward the genuinely personal. Annie wrote back from her comfortable retirement with the same clear, direct intelligence she had always had, and in her letter about Edmund's death she said something that Cecilia kept. "You have conducted yourself in this life with more dignity than circumstances required. Dignity in easy circumstances is manners. Dignity in your circumstances is character." She was 35 years old. She had been at Hargrove Hall for 14 years. She had arrived knowing nothing about it, and she now knew everything about it, every room and every season, every person who worked in it and every family in the village who depended on the estate, every drain and every drain that needed attention and every fence that needed mending and every arrangement that was working and every one that was not. She knew the school and the schoolmaster's requirements and the baker and the gamekeeper and the vicar and Annie Tull, who was now in her 60s and declining the steep paths but still walking the lanes. She knew this place the way you know a language you have translated yourself into, word by word, over a long time, until one day you realize you are no longer translating. She ran the hall. She ran it with James's name at the top of the letterhead because that was the correct arrangement, and she ran it in her own right in every other sense. She attended meetings of the County Board of Education and had strong opinions that she now, unlike in the early years, expressed directly. She corresponded with other women managing large households and large estates, and compared notes on everything from agricultural practices to the selection of staff. She funded the expansion of the village school, which had needed it for years, and which she finally accomplished in 1883 with a combination of the estate funds and a private donation she organized from 3 neighboring families. James went to school in 1882, at 13, after 3 years of concentrated home education that had covered more ground than most schools would in the same time. He came home on holidays full of opinions about things he had encountered, bringing them to her the way he had always brought his questions, not for approval, but for the pleasure of thinking out loud with someone who thought back. She stood at the front door the first time he left for school and watched the carriage go down the drive, and felt the familiar cut of departure. Then she turned and went inside and looked at the house around her. The library, the morning room with its chair by the window, the corridor with the estate office at the end, the kitchen where Mrs. Farrow was already at work, the smell of bread coming up through the house. The garden through the hall window with the oak tree at the far end beginning its spring bud. The rooms she had cleaned and rearranged and lived in and learned. The walls she had read against and sat against and known in every light. From the bright flat light of summer mornings to the long slant of October afternoons to the particular quality of March morning when the frost was still on the grass and the sky was the color of something beginning. She went to the morning room. She sat in the chair by the window. She looked at the garden. The place felt different with James away at school and Edmund 3 years dead, and Mrs. Prout retired to her sister's house in Somerset, from which she wrote quarterly letters in the same neat, controlled hand, answering the questions Cecilia still sent her. Different but not empty. It was too present for empty. Too full of the accumulated evidence of what had happened here, what had been built here, what had been endured and decided and done. She thought about the night of October the 13th, 1869. She thought about the servants' hall and the copper pots and Annie Tull's steady hands and Ruth's quiet tears and Dot's round, open face in the doorway. She thought about the moment at 3 in the morning when James had arrived into the warm room and cried with an indignant certainty that announced clearly his intention to be fully present. She thought about sitting in the chair they had brought down from the footman's dormitory, with the child in her arms, counting his fingers in the firelight. She thought about not sending word to London. She thought about Edmund arriving on the 15th and her sitting in the morning room in this very chair, looking at him, not standing. She had known on that October morning that something had changed, that she had come through something and arrived somewhere, as Dot had said to the journalist 30 years later, without knowing she was being described, somewhere real, where she actually was. She had been here ever since. In 1907, Cecilia Hargrove died in this house, in the bedroom at the end of the Upper West Corridor on a Tuesday in April. She was 61 years old. James, the Duke of Ashwell, was 38, and sat beside her through the last 3 days with a steadiness that was entirely his own and that she recognized and was grateful for. She died in the morning before the sun had fully come up, while the garden was still in the low horizontal light of early spring. James was holding her hand. The window was open a little, and the morning air came through, cool and green, carrying the smell of the kitchen garden below. The obituary that ran in the county paper called her a devoted mother and a steadfast duchess. It mentioned her support of the local school and her management of the estate during her son's minority. It did not mention the night of October 13th, 1869. It did not mention the servants' hall or Annie Tull or the copper pots. It did not mention the particular quality of stillness she had brought to a morning room chair in October 1869, when a man walked through the door and she remained seated. She would not have expected it to. She had not, in 40 years, required the headline to confirm the truth of anything. The oak tree at the end of the lawn was old by now, thick and sure, its first green of the season showing at the tips of every branch in the April morning. From the upper window you could see it clearly, the way it stood in the garden, rooted and present and still, the way it had stood since long before anyone in the current story arrived and would stand long after. The light moved across the lawn. The morning continued.